Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on June the 20th. Today, I'd like to update you on heat unit accumulation, talk about all the interesting colors I've been seeing in our corn crop lately, discuss rolling of soybeans, and talk about what to expect in your field walks next week with this high heat coming at us this weekend. So let's begin by talking about our current heat unit accumulation. Even though we got some heat this past week, we're still behind. It's hard to catch up when, this time in other years, the temperatures were also warm. Now, based on heat unit counts on a planting date, let's say of May 1st in the East Lansing area, we've accumulated 418 heat units. In comparison, we're down 151 heat units from last year and 116 heat units behind the 5-year average. Now, going south to Coldwater, we're 173 heat units behind last year and 139 behind the 5-year average. Finally, going north to Mount Pleasant area, we are 155 heat units behind last year and 115 behind the 5-year average. Now, with the 90-degree plus temperatures coming this weekend, it'll be interesting to see the crop's response. We know that we don't count heat units over 86 degrees, and we know that when things get too hot, we can actually push the crop backwards. But being that we're going into this heat with such a nice, 1 inch or so of rain across most of the area, I expect by the end of next week, this crop will look a whole lot different. Now, as for, these interesting colors in the corn crop lately, this has been the majority of my service calls this week. The first one I had was on a sandy soil in mid-Michigan where, boy, large portions of the fields just looked to be this pale yellow while, other parts of the field were green. Upon entering the field, I quickly noticed that yellow color was actually not yellow plants, but instead yellow and green stripes running up and down the length of the corn leaves. This, what we call interveinal chlorosis, is always caused by micronutrient deficiencies, whereas if the entire plant was yellow, I'd be thinking more about maybe nitrogen deficiency. Now, being a sandier soil, my first thought was that I might be looking at a magnesium deficiency. Yellow sands, they tend to be lower in soil pH, and then that lower pH causes plants not to be able to take up magnesium, even if there is plenty in the soil. Now, luckily, the Golden Harvest seed advisor who was with me and the customer in the field that we did happen to have access to the soil test that was taken 2 years ago. And after looking at that test, and boy, we learned that this field had areas as low as 5.4 on the pH scale. I'm pretty certain that magnesium deficiency was our problem. Now, for corn, we like to have a soil pH of around 6.4. The problem is that pH is measured in a logarithmic scale and not an arithmetic scale. Therefore, going from a 6.4 to a 5.4 is not like just going down 1 point on the scale. With a logarithmic scales, you move the decimal each time you move across the scale. So therefore, it's like moving from 0 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000. For each point you move away from what is neutral. Now, because the pH won't let us get the needed magnesium from the soil, the only solution is to apply it as a foliar. Now, this can be done with a micro pack that is high in magnesium, or simply by applying about 15 pounds of Epsom salts and about 20 gallons of water per acre. This will green up those plants, but it's only a temporary solution. Additional applications may be needed to keep up with the plant's demands. And, more importantly, lime will be needed to apply on this field, probably over multiple years just to get this field back into shape. I'm also getting colors on purple corn, with the restricted roots this spring, and now that fast growing top growth, works. We're really kind of expecting this is going to be common for the sugars that are produced from photosynthesis in those leaves. They're just not going to be able to move down to the roots as fast as they're being produced. Therefore, these sugars called anthocyanin, they back up into the plant in excess quantities, and they just turn those leaves purple. Now, in the particular call I was on this week, the farmer said that his corn, it went from slightly purple one day to completely black the next. Now, upon visiting the field, it did look black from the roadside, but when you walk down the rows, you could see that it was just dark purple. Now, the good news is that these plants will start expanding their root systems pretty quickly with this recent weather, and yeah, normal green color should also return fairly quickly with no yield loss expected. Interesting enough, some corn genetic backgrounds will actually turn purple more quickly than other backgrounds, and in this case, it was a hybrid that we pretty much know that it produces and holds a lot of sugars. Now, for the next topic, I'm still actually getting some questions about rolling soybeans. So I figured, being that I haven't really taken the time to discuss this management practice on my podcast before, I wanted to just take a few minutes to address it. Now, from an agronomic standpoint, rolling soybeans represents a kind of an interesting intersection of risk and reward and the idea of soybean management. Now, while this practice, it's actually been common in other regions, particularly Canada, we're seeing an increased adoption of rolling soybeans across the United States. Really, especially in those fields, maybe with some significant rock concerns that just that hampers the ease of harvest out there. Now, the primary agronomic considerations, they center around timing and soil conditions. Rolling can be conducted pre-plant, immediately post-plant, or even during the early vegetative stages. Now, air temperature, soil moisture are both critical to success with this practice. And when rolling emerged plants, success is greatest when rolling during the heat of the day. When our plants bend more easily, it kind of reduces that risk of snapping those beans off. And then doing it in not overly wet soils, that can lead to compaction issues that may actually negate any of the potential benefits. Now, field trials, they've consistently shown that plants rolled during that V1 to V3 growth stage, that of course means you've got 1 to 3 trifoliates fully exposed on the top of that plant. They recuperate fairly easily, typically, showing complete recovery within 2 to 3 days post rolling. Now, from a physiological perspective, rolling can enhance that seed to soil contact when you do it pre emergence, and that potentially improves germination uniformity. However, the practice does present some risk, including potential stand reduction because we may be rolled under the wrong conditions. So, that decision to roll should be based on field specific conditions and your equipment conditions and maybe some historical harvest challenges. So, just give me a call if you want to discuss your individual particular farm situation there. Now, as for expectations next week, I would expect to see a fair amount of what we call rapid growth syndrome. Now, with the heat these next few days and the recent moisture, our corn top growth will happen quickly. And it'll cause these fast growing plants to buggy whip. And, that means they're going to remain tight in the whirl for a few days. Now, when these plants again relax and they return to a more normal growing conditions, these tightly wrapped whorls, they're going to unravel and show just this pale yellow inside of the leaves where, the chlorophyll just has yet to be deposited. And these yellow flashes of freshly unrolled leaves they'll soon turn green, and that entire show will be over in about a week. So expect to see these scattered yellow corn plants in your fields next week, but don't worry about them. It's just expected right now, and it's definitely not yield limiting. So, as we wrap up this week's Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast, let's continue to walk our fields. Let's look for those nutrient deficiencies and, if we need to, provide some foliar treatment. Yeah, if you do plan to apply some in-season nitrogen, let's be careful not to let the crop get ahead of us because, boy, it's gonna happen fast this year. And with any luck, this heat might just burn off some of those tar spot spores starting to brew in our corn canopies. Time will tell. Again, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great week.